You're listening to This Week in Palestine, a program rooted in truth, resistance, and unwavering solidarity. This is where voices from the front lines of occupation meet global movements for justice, dignity, and liberation. Each week, we bring you uncompromising reporting, incisive analysis, and raw, unfiltered commentary that centers Palestinian experiences while connecting them to broader struggles against empire, racism, and repression. From policy and propaganda to daily survival and global activism, we examine the systems that shape life in Palestine and how those same systems reverberate across borders, impacting communities from Ferguson to Jenin. A quick note: the views expressed during this hour belong to our hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect those of WZBC, Boston College, or its Board of Trustees. This isn't a space for sanitized sound bites or polite avoidance. It's a space for truth, bold, urgent, and unapologetic. Thank you for walking this path with us. Let's begin. You are listening to This Week in Palestine, Truth and Justice Radio. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Muhammad Al-Ghul, and it's a profound honor to welcome you back to This Week in Palestine. Today is Sunday, August 10th, 2025. And once again, our attention turns to Gaza and the West Bank lands under siege, where lives are uprooted and voices are too often silenced by global indifference. As headlines fade and the spotlight shifts, the reality remains. Families continue to endure displacement, communities hold fast with unwavering courage, and the pursuit of dignity persists through unimaginable hardship. And still, one question reverberates: how long must a people suffer before the world chooses conscience over convenience, action over apathy? Stay with us as we seek truth, amplify resilience, and carry forward the flame of justice. This journey is not ours alone. It is shared, and it is sacred. To understand what's happening now, we must first ask, what does it mean to occupy Gaza? For years, Israel claimed it disengaged from Gaza in 2005, removing settlers and military bases. But the reality is far more insidious. Israel has maintained full control over Gaza's borders, airspace, and maritime access. It controls what goes in and out: food, medicine, fuel, even electricity. It monitors and restricts movement, and it has bombed Gaza repeatedly, turning neighborhoods into rubble. That's not disengagement. That's siege. That's occupation. Now, in 2025, Israel is preparing to reoccupy Gaza City, a move that signals not just military escalation, but a return to full territorial control. According to reports from Truthout and Gulf News, the plan involves forcibly displacing over 1 million Palestinians, pushing them into camps in the south, and establishing a security perimeter under indefinite Israeli military control. Netanyahu says Israel doesn't intend to govern Gaza long term, but the infrastructure of occupation is already being laid, and it's being done without any consultation with the people of Gaza. This brings us to the question that many still ask: what caused October 7th? The answer cannot be reduced to a single day. October 7th was not born in a vacuum. It was the result of decades of occupation, blockade, humiliation, and violence. Hamas's attack was a symptom of a deeper disease: the denial of Palestinian freedom. As The Nation and the Libertarian Institute have reported, the attack was also a response to provocations in Jerusalem, settler violence in the West Bank, and the complete collapse of any meaningful peace process. But what happened after October 7th is just as revealing. Israel launched one of the most devastating military campaigns in modern history. Over 61,000 Palestinians have been killed, according to Gaza's health ministry. Entire cities have been flattened. Starvation has become a weapon of war, and yet the official Israeli narrative continues to shift. The number of Israeli deaths on October 7th has been revised downward from 1,600 to 1,200 and now to 815. Investigations have revealed that many of those killed were victims of Israeli military fire, including under the controversial Hannibal Directive, which authorizes lethal force to prevent hostage taking even if it means killing Israeli civilians. So we must ask, is Israel now exposed to the world? The answer is yes and no. Yes, because the mask is slipping. The international community is watching genocide unfold in real time. Western countries have halted arms exports or condemned the war. The UN Human Rights Chief has called for an immediate halt to Israel's takeover plans, citing violations of international law and the right of Palestinians to self-determination. But no, because accountability remains remains elusive. Despite mounting evidence, Israel continues to enjoy impunity, shielded by powerful allies and a media landscape that often echoes its talking point. Netanyahu insists there is no starvation in Gaza, even as 900,000 children go hungry and aid seekers are shot dead. The lie persists, but the world is no longer blind. The occupation of Gaza is not just a military strategy, it's a political project rooted in domination. October 7th was a rupture, but it also revealed the fault lines of a system built on apartheid, displacement, and denial. And now, with Israel's plans for full control of Gaza, the question of Palestinian freedom is more urgent than ever. This is not just about borders. It's about dignity. It's about survival. And it's about whether the world will continue to look away or finally choose justice over complicity. I believe the world will continue to look away. The suffering in Gaza and the West Bank isn't a temporary crisis. It's a system of violence that's been normalized, funded, and politically protected. As long as the Israel lobby, led by AIPAC, holds sway over U.S. politics, Palestinian freedom will remain out of reach. But here's the truth: change is coming. AIPAC may have bought off senators, representatives, and presidents, including Trump, but their legacy is already being written in shame. These officials will go down in history not as leaders, but as enablers of genocide. Their children and our children, the future leaders, are watching this unfold in real time. They are witnessing starvation, the bombings, the mass graves. They are seeing the truth not through filtered press releases, but through live streams, survivor testimonies, and the raw footage of war crimes. You are listening to This Week in Palestine, Truth and Justice Radio, and they will not forget. The next generation will not accept what their parents accepted. They will not be bribed, silenced, or manipulated by billion-dollar lobbies. They will kick AIPAC and the Israeli lobby out of Washington, out of Europe, out of every space where power has been used to crush justice. Because they are not just watching, they are becoming witnesses. And witnesses become change makers. Even now, support for Israel is collapsing among young Americans across the political spectrum. AIPAC's influence is waning, its propaganda failing, its censorship exposed. The tide is turning not because politicians suddenly grew a conscience, but because the people did. So yes, the world may still look away today, but tomorrow belongs to those who refuse to be complicit. Tomorrow belongs to Gaza's orphans, to the students marching for divestment, to the artists, healers, and truth-tellers who never stopped believing in liberation. What is the price of truth? What October 7th revealed. The price Palestinians have paid is staggering. It's a cost measured not just in lives lost, but in generations uprooted, homes erased, and futures stolen. And for decades, this suffering unfolded slowly out of sight, out of mind. The world watched passively, if at all, as Gaza was strangled by siege and the West Bank carved up by settlements. The violence was normalized. The silence was deafening. Whether October 7th happened or not, the machinery of oppression was already in motion. The blockade, the checkpoints, the raids, the demolitions, these were not reaction. They were policy. They were the architecture of apartheid. But October 7th did something that years of advocacy, documentation, and resistance could not. It ripped off the mask. It exposed the collaborators, those who stood with Israel while pretending to stand with Palestine. It revealed the Arab regimes who rushed to normalize ties with Israel, even as bombs fell on Palestinian children. It showed us who could be trusted and who had sold their silence for diplomatic deals and economic gain. In a historic shift, the Arab League, including countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Qatar, issued a formal condemnation of Hamas's actions on October 7th and called for its disarmament. While some hailed this as a step toward peace, many Palestinians saw it as a betrayal, a signal that even Arab leadership was willing to distance itself from resistance in exchange for political favor. But Palestinians are no longer guessing who stands with them. The masks are off. The lines are drawn. And the people, those in the camps, the rubble, the streets, know exactly who to trust. October 7th didn't just mark a turning point in the war. It marked a turning point in clarity. It forced the world to choose, complicity or conscience. And while many governments chose complicity, the people, especially the youth, chose truth. The future belongs to those who saw the genocide unfold in real time. It belongs to the generation that watched live streams of starvation, drone strikes, and mass graves. These young people will not forget. They will not be gaslit. And they will not inherit the silence of their predecessors. October 7th was a tragedy, but it was also a revelation. And in that revelation, Palestinians found something powerful. the truth about their allies, the truth about their enemies, and the truth about the world they're fighting to build. On today's episode, we bring you a powerful conversation with Moin Rabbani, hosted by India and Global Left, exploring the deeper implications of Israel's plans for Gaza and what they mean for Palestinians on the ground. This discussion cuts through the noise to examine the political calculations, colonial ambitions, and human cost behind the headlines. Tune in as we unpack the realities shaping Gaza's future and the broader struggle for Palestinian liberation.
First, if we look at the situation in the Gaza Strip, you have the ongoing, in fact, intensifying genocide. And as part of the genocide, you have the starvation policy, which is now resulting in famine, in which growing numbers of people, particularly the vulnerable children and the elderly, are beginning to basically drop dead from starvation. And the overall purpose of Israel's current campaign in the Gaza Strip is to seek to forcibly relocate the entire population of the Gaza Strip in the south of the territory abutting the Egyptian border, with the intention to basically expel them from the territory. Now, there's a challenge there for Israel because Egypt is not going to accept participating in the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip. Like other Arab states, it has so far been fine with Israel slaughtering Palestinians in their homeland, but it draws the line at Israel expelling Palestinians from Palestine into their own territory. And so Israel is basically seeking to concentrate the vast majority of the population of the Gaza Strip in this, what it calls a humanitarian zone. It's actually a concentration camp where conditions of life will be so insufferable that Palestinians will increasingly, Israel hopes, find ways to leave that enclave, concentration camp, simply in order to survive. It would be a situation more akin to that which we saw in Syria in the previous decade, where people try to flee unlivable circumstances as individuals or in small groups rather than an organized mass expulsion, which again would require either Egyptian cooperation or would require Israel to take measures that may put its existing arrangements with Egypt at risk. The second part has to do with the West Bank, and here you see an intensification of Israel's not only violence against the Palestinians there directly by the army and by its settler auxiliaries, but also a growing momentum towards annexation by, for example, establishing new settlements, by adopting key settlement projects. One is known as the E1 corridor, which would effectively bisect the West Bank. The Europeans have for years been saying that if Israel goes ahead with this plan, it would constitute a red line. But as with every other red line that the Europeans have communicated to Israel, my suspicion is that if Israel goes ahead with it, the Europeans will basically look the other way and say, that's not red. And so we see an intensification of the annexationist policies in the West Bank, and the Israeli parliament is already discussing draft resolutions that would call for the formal annexation of the West Bank. The third issue, which you mentioned, is this expanded Israeli offensive. If you look at media reporting, what we're basically being told is that the Israeli government, specifically Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, is going to order the Israeli military to establish indefinite, direct Israeli physical control over the entirety of the Gaza Strip. So this would mean returning to the situation as it existed before 1994, when Israel began redeploying from much of the Gaza Strip in the context of the implementation of the first phase of the Oslo agreements. Now, What much of the media reporting is suggesting is that the motive behind this initiative is Netanyahu's desire to hold on to power, to remain in office in order to avoid court cases and so on, or alternatively, that he's doing so in order to keep key coalition partners who are even more extreme right than he is, in order to keep them on board and to prevent his governing coalition from disintegrating. I'm not saying those factors are irrelevant, and at some level they probably do play a role, but we're basically being asked to believe that the entire Israeli government, the entire Israeli political leadership, the entire military leadership of Israel, and much of Israeli society is going along with this plan in the full knowledge that its primary purpose is to keep a single individual in office. That strikes me as implausible. I think what we're really seeing is kind of the same push, the same momentum that we're seeing in the West Bank. Territorial expansion, seeking to incorporate these territories into Israel, and expulsion of the existing Palestinian population. It's really that simple. And if you look at Israeli elites, Israeli government opinions, and so on, the demands not only for the destruction of the Gaza Strip and removing its Palestinian population, but also for its annexation and the building of new Jewish settlements in there to replace those that Israel abandoned in 2005, is quite widespread. Having said that, there is significant opposition to this plan, and it comes from two sources. The first is from the military leadership. And interestingly enough, the chief of staff of the Israeli military was more or less personally appointed by Netanyahu. So, and very much shares kind of the same political perspectives and philosophy and so on as Netanyahu and his government. So this is not some kind of, dissident general by any means, but he recognizes that his military is exhausted, that it will have to call up substantial reserve forces, that it lacks the men and material for a prolonged occupation of the Gaza Strip, and that even if Israel were to succeed in the physical occupation of the entirety of the Gaza Strip, it's not an event that just happens and it ends. Once you occupy it, you have to maintain control over it. You have to fight an insurgency and so on. And the military leadership, or at least key parts of it, appear to have come to the conclusion that the Israeli military is simply not capable of successfully conducting this task with the means at its disposal. Second source of opposition comes from sectors within Israeli society for whom the priority is retrieving Israel's hostages, its captives from the Gaza Strip. I mean, all those that remain within the Gaza Strip were actually on October 7th soldiers on active duty. So they're not civilian hostages, they're military captives. But nevertheless, these people understand, that you have to make one of two choices. Either you reach an agreement with the Palestinians that will end the war, and in the context of which there will be an exchange of captives between Israel and the Palestinians, Israel will essentially have to withdraw from the Gaza Strip. Or alternatively, you intensify military operations and the genocidal military campaign, which will either lead to the death of those captives, or will not result in Israel being able to successfully rescue them from captivity. I'm not sure, it's a significant sector of Israeli public opinion which prioritizes an agreement to retrieve the captives, even at the cost of ending the war, the cost of ending the war as they see it. I'm not sure I would quite characterize it as a majority, and they certainly are not represented within governing circles. I think for the military leadership, they're of two minds, in addition to the factors I mentioned previously. Since the remaining captives are all soldiers, What kind of message does it send to those currently in Israel's armed forces and those who are expected to serve in it in future, whether as conscripts or as reservists, when your military leadership willfully launches a military campaign in the full knowledge that this is sealing the fate of members of the armed forces who are being held captive? I think that plays as well. And what's interesting here is that the one factor which is not figuring in Israeli calculations about whether or not to expand the campaign is the response of the West. I think they've taken it for granted, I would argue probably correctly so, that Israel can do whatever it pleases, can do whatever it wants, and there will be no meaningful consequences attached to its actions, no matter how genocidal, by its sponsors and allies in North America and in Europe.
I want to discuss a little bit about these negotiations. I mean, as much as it is very difficult to even be optimistic about these negotiations, but one has to engage with it, or else one lapses into total pessimism. Um, we are hearing two kinds of things. One, obviously, coming out of Washington, which is this very narrow focus on a temporary ceasefire in exchange of the captives, and there are not much about the long term, a permanent ceasefire or withdrawal of Israeli military from Gaza. So that's one set of things we are hearing in media, and then there is the whole sort of plan, if you like, where the Arab states are also involved. The Europeans are also voicing them, which is this Hamas laying down arms. And the PA would be, they're not talking about a coalition, as I understand. They're talking about PA taking full control of a unified Palestine. Now, given what Israel is doing in the occupied West Bank, and including the escalation at Alaska recently again, it is erroneous to imagine that it is about Hamas or it is just about Gaza. And given the unpopularity, not just the unpopularity of the PA, but the inability to cause any kind of effective resistance in the West Bank, what is the meaning of what the Arab states are involved in terms of the Palestinian resolution?
Yeah. Well, this ties a bit into the previous discussion we just had, which is that people who have looked at this entire Israeli discussion about expanding the military campaign and seizing full control of the Gaza Strip and so on. Some people say, this is a genuine intention. This is what Israel wants to do, and this is what the government is seeking to persuade or order the military to implement. Other people suggest that it's a last-ditch effort by the Israeli government to basically hold this as a threat against the Palestinians, that if they do not make further concessions in the negotiations for an agreement, then this plan will go ahead. So it's more a negotiating tactic rather than a genuine concrete intention. And other people say, well, actually, all this talk of significant differences and shouting matches within the Israeli cabinet and between the political and military leaders is really all camouflage to basically have the opportunity to launch a surprise offensive. It's unclear which of these is the most persuasive, but I would certainly take an Israeli intention to seize the Gaza Strip seriously, particularly because Israel is acting in the confident knowledge that it can do whatever it pleases. So, if you can have it all, and that you can do so because the person who has his foot on the brake is basically pressing on the gas, why wouldn't you? But getting back to the negotiations, such as they are, there are essentially three or four issues in contention. The first is whether any agreement will be of a temporary nature or whether it will lead to a permanent cessation of hostilities, or at least a durable cessation of hostilities. Israel is insisting on a temporary pause, 60 days, during which Israeli captives are released in exchange for a number of Palestinian captives, and then Israel can simply return to its genocidal military campaign. For the Palestinians, this is a non-starter. They're insisting that if there is to be a phased agreement, as Israel insists, then the first phase has to include guarantees that the transition from the first to the second phase will not be used as a pretext by Israel, as it was in March, to resume its offensive with the devastating results for the civilian population of the Gaza Strip that we're seeing now. The second issue concerns an Israeli withdrawal. And the Palestinians are insisting that during the first phase of any agreement, that the Israelis withdraw to the positions that they held in March of this year before they basically abrogated the January agreement and resumed their military campaign. And that in the context of a comprehensive agreement, that there should be a full and comprehensive Israeli withdrawal from the entirety of the Gaza Strip. Regarding the exchange of captives, Palestinians are insisting that any agreement should include the release of all Palestinian captives in Israeli jails who have been given life sentences. So this would include people like the Fatah leader, Marwan Barghouti, the PFLP leader, Ahmed al-Saadat, and others who have not been released in previous exchanges. So these issues are, for Hamas, these are non-negotiable demands because from their point of view, they have already conceded on so much else that there is really no point in reaching an agreement that doesn't end the war, that doesn't lead to a withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip, and another point which I just neglected to mention, that doesn't restore the role of specialized United Nations agencies and professional humanitarian organizations in once again taking the lead on humanitarian deliveries and supplies to the Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip. In other words, ending the role of this death squad known as the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Now, what you mentioned about Hamas disarming, what happened, so from the American point of view, they would like to see an agreement, but really the only thing the Americans care about, I mean, they don't have a policy against genocide. They're quite happy to see Palestinians, Palestinian infants and children and the elderly die from starvation imposed by Israel. But the one thing they do genuinely care about, and the one thing that in particular the U.S. envoy, Steve Witkoff, personally and deeply cares about, is retrieving the captives that remain in the Gaza Strip. But he's also, I think, willing to subordinate this to increased Israeli military pressure because these people still live under the illusion that if you simply apply more military pressure, that Hamas will break and concede on, what by any objective standards would be a non-negotiable demand. I mean, why would you reach an agreement that doesn't end the military campaign? And Israelis have time and again sold themselves the idea, that one last push, one more offensive, one more massive bombing, one more week of starvation, and Hamas will change its negotiating position. That hasn't happened. But to get back to the point we were just discussing, so Witkoff, when he was recently in Israel, met with the families of the Israeli captives and informed them that he had received commitment from Hamas, I presume via the Egyptian and Qatari mediators, that Hamas was willing to disarm in the context of an agreement. Now, whether he was just making this up out of thin air or had misunderstood what had been communicated to him by the Egyptians or Qataris is unclear, but Hamas immediately came out with a statement that it had made no such commitment and would make no such commitment because it will only disarm when the occupation, which it views as the reason for it to have arms in the first place, comes to an end and an independent sovereign Palestinian state is established in the West Bank Bank and Gaza Strip, with Jerusalem as its capital. And the additional issue that you mentioned, which let's call it post-war governance, there's a fundamental contradiction here. So on the one hand, you have the Palestinians, and the Fatah movement and the Hamas movement have already reached an agreement that governance and administration in the Gaza Strip will be led by a committee of what I think what they call them as independent technocrats. In other words, people who are neither identifiable members of either the Fatah or Hamas movements, and which will operate within the framework of the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinians have already reached an agreement among themselves about that. The one Palestinian who has not yet openly endorsed this is the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, because he doesn't want to be seen to be party to any arrangement that was agreed with Hamas, even one that includes Hamas agreeing not to play a role in governance. And if you look at it from Hamas's perspective, it makes perfect sense. I mean, this is going to be an insurmountably massive challenge of reconstruction. Hamas certainly can't handle this itself if it, seeks to restore its hegemonic rule over the Gaza Strip that it had until October 2023. And it understands that there won't be a penny of foreign money coming to help reconstruction so long as it plays a role in governance. So it's quite happy not to play this role. But, it will have substantial influence because, of course, it remains the strongest movement in the Gaza Strip. Abbas's position is basically that the PA should come in and rule hegemonically the way it does now in the parts of the West Bank where it's able to, and this is not acceptable to Hamas. But even more importantly, I don't think the PA has a capacity to do that. Now, as far as the Arab states are concerned, they do not want to play a significant role in either post-war governance or post-war reconstruction unless the PA is directly involved and unless it is a process that is led by the Palestinian Authority. And they're doing this for two reasons. The first is they don't want to be basically throwing good money after bad. I mean, what's the point of doing this if in 6 months or 2 years or in 5 years the Gaza Strip is going to be destroyed again? And secondly, they are also demanding, as a price for their involvement, a clear and irreversible pathway to Palestinian statehood so that the underlying political issues are addressed and resolved. Against this, you have Israel that doesn't want any Palestinian governance in the Gaza Strip. I mean, they don't even want Palestinian governance in the West Bank. They're prepared to have a few collaborationist militias sowing chaos and anarchy. But apart from that, they don't want either Hamas or the Palestinian Authority or any other body that can legitimately claim to represent the Palestinian population to have any role in Palestinian governance. And this gets back to our earlier discussion where, Israel's preferred alternative is either that the Gaza Strip becomes de facto incorporated or de jure incorporated into Israel, or just a situation of chaos and anarchy. So the Europeans and probably to a lesser extent the Americans are open to the idea of restoring Palestinian governance in the Gaza Strip, but at the end of the day, they're not willing to confront Israel on this. They're certainly not going to exercise significant pressure on this. Yes, they'll make their criticisms, verbal condemnations, and so on. But as has been a central principle of the foreign policy of the United States and the European Union in particular, I would argue, towards Israel, impunity above all else.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning that right after that Witkoff visit, I guess it was last week, Saturday or something over the weekend, 2 days later, we hear about this leaked documents of Gaza reoccupation, right? So, I mean, if Witkoff visited Israel and 2 days later you hear about this massive reoccupation plan, then that tells enough about what's there in the minds of those who are in Washington. I also wonder if you think apart
Can I
from
just interrupt
yes,
you
yes.
and say what with this administration, I mean with the Biden administration, it was basically unconditional support for Israel, and whenever there's a contradiction, Biden would come out or Blinken would come out with a statement saying, you know, Israel has accepted our proposal, but the problem is Hamas is rejecting it, whereas reality was the exact opposite. With this administration, you get the impression that they do have their preferences, and those preferences may not be aligned with Israel's preferences, but when push comes to shove, they're content to let Israel take the lead and ultimately support whatever Israel does, even if it doesn't necessarily align with Washington's own policy preferences.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting point, and maybe like a few months before that would have been a bit more persuasive than what it is now. But my sense is increasingly that when it comes to other areas in West Asia, for instance, Syria or Iran, I think the United States has a much stronger preference. Now, even there, Israel sometimes forces them to act otherwise, but they do have a greater preference or more stronger preference there because they have a vision of
Certainly.
West Asia where they, let's call this Abraham 2, where, you make a broad alliance where you induct Syria, even Lebanon by ousting Hezbollah from South Lebanon, and maybe even involve Turkey as a bulwark against, ultimately BRICS, led by China, Russia, and Iran would be involved there. So I think that's the bigger vision there, and so
Yes.
they have a much stronger say in Syria that we don't want you to balkanize Syria. We just hold on. But I'm not sure what Washington, what its interests are when it comes to Palestine, and I'm increasingly I felt that Washington doesn't have any preference there. It's mostly the lobby that controls there. So I think 2 months or 2 or 3 months ago, I would have been more persuaded by this line of argument that the Trump administration does have some preference in Palestine, but ultimately, when push comes to shove, they give up. But now it seems to me that they are completely hijacked by the lobby. I mean, look at how Trump speaks. He says that, well, Bibi wants to control it. If he wants to control it, he will control it. I think he would be the best person to control Gaza in that case. I mean, even if you pay close attention to their words, it's pretty clear that they are completely enslaved by the billionaire supremacists, the Zionist billionaire supremacist money.
I would put it slightly differently. I mean, these other situations that you mentioned, you know, Iran, Lebanon, Syria, there you can make an argument that the United States has national security interests, at least as perceived by Washington. And these states have powerful actors in them. So, you know, you have Iran is a nuclear threshold state. You know, Syria is important to the United States, perhaps less on its own, but because of the relationship with Turkey. You mentioned the BRICS and so on. So all of these give Washington a direct interest and a stake in the outcomes there that it doesn't have in Washington, in Palestine. I mean, Palestine is significant and of interest to Washington only to the extent that it could complicate U.S. relations with other states in the region. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that Washington's key partners in the region, you know, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, Qatar, and so on, have not been prepared to exercise any leverage over the United States in response to its unconditional support of Israel. And given this Arab inertia, there is absolutely no reason for Washington to change course. I mean, even in the context of these negotiations, you know, the two key Arab parties involved in them are Egypt and Qatar. Now, they know precisely, you know, how Israel has been consistently seeking to shift the goalposts, sabotage these talks, and so on. But they almost never come out with clear statements explaining to the world why these negotiations are failing. And it's for a very simple reason, because that would complicate their relationship with the United States. And so, you know, unless and until states in the region, whether Arab or otherwise, are able to, and willing, more importantly, to make a direct relationship between their relations with Washington and Washington's support for Israel for its genocidal campaign against the Palestinians, Washington doesn't have any incentive. I think, yeah, maybe in principle, Washington would like to, whether Trump administration or anyone else would like to see the Israeli captives released from the Gaza Strip. And to be clear, it's about the Israeli captives, not about Palestinian captives. And it would like to see this war conflict, however you want to call it, it would like to see the guns fall silent. Trump can then pose as a peacemaker and get another Nobel Peace Prize nomination from wherever and so on. But that is not a core U.S. interest. The way, for example, ending the war in Ukraine would be. So Israel has a much bigger stake in this issue than does the United States. And so the United States will defer to this, will defer to Israel on this.
Yeah, and I guess it's also the relationship between the Arab states and the U.S. is
Yes.
it also it's important to note that it's not their dependency on the United States is also contingent on what they decide to what's their decision insofar as their relationship with Iran and the rest of the world would be concerned. So, for instance, for a very long time, the petrodollar reserves have been almost entirely plugged into the US-based dollar system. I mean, through London, eventually it ends up at Wall Street and, real estate and so on and so forth. But they have been extremely dependent on this dollar-based imperial system. And so given what we have seen with Russia, for instance, with all the sanctions of 300 to 400 billion US dollar, they are in a vulnerable situation. And then but they are also now decreasing those reserves in some ways. I mean, part of that is projects like NEOM and others in Saudi Arabia, but also their investments in other productive sectors, given they think that the petrodollar may fall apart someday because of climate change or whatever. And then we saw some processes of normalization with Iran. That's important, and what happens in Yemen ultimately, because it's not just about inability to confront Israel and the United States, but it's also about your approach to the region, because you get threatened by an expansion of Iranian influence. And if you cannot resolve Yemen, if you cannot have a normal tie with Iran, or if you cannot democratize itself in Egypt, you are extremely suspicious of a force like Hamas, who have very close ties with Iran, isn't it?
Yes and no. I mean, Iran is seen as a significant regional actor that, of course, opposes U.S. influence and dominance of the region. But we're not talking about the 1970s, where the U.S. had to take into account that there was a rival global superpower, the Soviet Union, and worry about its own client regimes defecting to the rival camp. I mean, it's very unlikely, for example, that we're going to wake up tomorrow and read in the newspaper that Morocco or Egypt is now being dominated by Iran. I mean, Iran is a regional power, not a global one. And so I'm trying to recall where I was going with this, but
I
for
guess my main point here was that maybe not for the United States. I mean, the United States, I do think, is, if not the Soviet Union, they are concerned about China, which maybe at this point in time, they are not as extended as the Soviet Union used to be in West Asia. But nevertheless, there is a paranoia in Washington. But I was saying that with respect to the Arab states, I'm not sure if they are not concerned about the potential influence of Iran. And that my point was, if you don't have a progressive, positive, pragmatic approach to Iran, if you still continue to think in terms of what you have been doing, then there is disincentive in sort of doing things in Palestine. That's my bigger point.
Yeah, well, again, yes and no, because these conservative Arab monarchies in particular, there's no love lost between them and Iran. And the increasingly close relationship between these states and Israel that we've witnessed during the past 10 or 15 years is in large part a function of seeking allies in their struggle against Iranian influence in the region. But what has happened is that Iran made clear that it could pose a significant threat to these states through, for example, the Yemeni missile and drone attacks on Saudi and later Emirati territory on the one hand, and the direct Iranian attack on key Aramco oil installations in eastern Saudi Arabia. And the United States proved unable and unwilling to defend these states against these attacks. And on top of that, yes, they viewed Israel as an ally, but they don't want to be dominated by Israel either. And more importantly, Israel is now seen by them less as a strategic ally and more as a regional arsonist. And this at a time when key Arab states, particularly the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, have been normalizing their relations with Iran specifically in order to insulate themselves from the threat of a war in the Persian Gulf region. And so, they've completely changed their outlook from the first Trump administration, where they were all gung-ho about maximum pressure and regime change and withdrawing from the nuclear agreement and so on. That's not on their agenda now. They would like to see stable relationships so that the recent Iranian missile attack on the U.S. Air Force base in Qatar, which was largely symbolic, does not become kind of a foretaste of much more devastating attacks in the event of a new war.
Yeah, fair enough. I don't disagree, but I do think you are probably a bit more positive about the Arab states. Let's shift away.
Not at all.
Okay. Oh, then maybe we are on the same page, because I was thinking there about their role during the recent escalation against Iran, and they were completely they collaborated completely. Even though there is an argument there to say that they don't want it, they didn't want a flare up because that would bring a lot of instability, but they never resisted. I mean, they opened up their airspace.
No. And I think we need to make a distinction between not wanting something and doing something about it when it actually
Right.
starts. Let's be clear. They were not going to use their air defenses to shoot down Israeli, let alone American aircraft going to bomb Iran. But that doesn't mean that they were actively involved or actively encouraging this conflict. My view is that they didn't want it because they viewed its ramifications as a real threat. And the most dangerous conflict from their perspective is one that fails. And this one did not succeed. There was no regime change in Iran that these states could benefit from. Iran may now take a much harder position in its negotiations with the United States. It may even simply abandon negotiations with the United States and decide for real security, it needs to go the North Korean route and develop a nuclear weapon of its own. Well, how secure is that going to make these Arab states feel?
Can I ask one final question? I know it's
Sure.
a bit late on at your side. Okay, I want to take a step back and ask you about how about your thoughts on the long-term trajectory of the Palestinian liberation movement, and how eventually this anti-colonial movement would succeed. I personally think of 2 to 3 cases, but in each of them I get hopeless eventually, and maybe like you can help us, because I interviewed Noam Chomsky several times, and one of the things he said that never be hopeless, and he used to tell us about East Timor, for instance. He said that was one of the cases where all powers converged on this very tiny population, but something happened miraculously. So one way out I see is that eventually, if something changes in the United States, let's say a revolutionary change comes about, a Mamdani or a Sanders-like movement comes together, and people who are actually sympathetic to the Palestinian movement comes comes to power, and then the whole facade falls apart. So the US withdraws all its support, military, diplomatic, and the empire, Zionist empire, falls apart. That's one possibility. I'm not hopeful about, having followed the Sanders movement and having, closely, someone who closely looks at the power of the Wall Street. I don't think American hegemony, financial hegemony, or capitalist hegemony is falling away. So that's one side. The other side is the more United Nations based approach, and there maybe you can comment also about these recent gestures from Canada, UK, and France. So that's more and more nations come together, recognize more and more rights for Palestinians, and there is a legal pressure there. That's also something I don't think will work out unless the United States changes its way. And then finally is the power of force. China or someone else. I mean, the Arab states, they come together and they do a blockade, they attack Israel and Turkey. I don't think that's going to happen anyway. So, is there any other option I'm missing? And comment on all these three options.
Well, the future is, of course, typically very difficult and usually impossible to predict. But if we look at what has happened in the past 2 years, I would describe the Gaza genocide as Israel's Sharpeville moment, here referring to the 1960 massacre in South Africa. That kind of irreversibly changed global public opinion about South Africa. And the difference here is that South Africa really only needed the support of the US government and the British government, arguably. Israel is in a much more vulnerable position. It's a much smaller country than South Africa. It doesn't have anywhere near the resources that South Africa has. And for Israel, the support of Western public opinion has always been a key strategic asset. And that is now irrevocably gone and cannot and will never be restored. I mean, in my view, Israel's most important strategic asset since its establishment was the solid bipartisan consensus in the US political class in support of Israel. And in England, you had the same. When it came to Israel, there really wasn't much to distinguish a Labour from a Tory government. In Germany, a social democratic from a Christian democratic government. That is all beginning to change. Now, you may respond and say, yeah, but Sharpeville was in 1960. Mandela wasn't elected until I believe it was 1994. That's true, but history seems to be moving more rapidly in this case. Israel was always an electoral asset for Western political candidates, whereas Palestine was always, for all intents and purposes, a certificate of political death. That is no longer the case. You can support Palestine and survive politically. You can even get elected against a Labour candidate in Britain. Israel is increasingly becoming an electoral burden. So at that kind of macro level, these are fundamental, profound changes. And the proof that they're of vital importance and that Israel recognizes their vital importance is this absolute hysterical campaign they've been conducting, far exceeding anything you saw during the Iraq War or the Vietnam War. About anyone who so much as raises their voice about genocide has to be fired, has to be silenced, has to be deported, has to be imprisoned, and so on. So they recognize the importance of these changes. They will take time to work through the political system. But if 5 years ago you would have told me that there would even be a draft resolution to limit the sale of weapons to Israel, I would have told you, you're living in an alternate reality. Well, now it is reality. Secondly, within the region, there were very significant changes throughout the region in the wake of the 1948 war and the establishment of Israel and the Palestinian Nakba. They were, of course, a reflection of local conditions in each of the states and societies concerned, But what they had in common was that they were also a response to the failure of the existing Arab regimes to respond effectively to the challenges of Zionism and the Nakba and the establishment of a colonial state in the heart of the Arab world. What's different this time is that people are not responding to the failure of their governments. In other words, it's not as if their governments acted and didn't succeed. They didn't even try. They literally did absolutely nothing. And I think if we were to have this same discussion 10 years from now, we would be talking about its impacts in the region. I can't imagine that this will be without significant consequences. Where, how, when, of what type, that's an entirely different question. And also, I think, reflects the lack of coherent political organization in the region in the wake of the crushing of all opposition and dissent in the wake of the Arab upheaval of the past decade. And then, thirdly, of course, you have the decline, or at least the relative decline, of US global hegemony and the rise not only of other global powers like China, but also of global coalitions. I mean, of course, India is in a very different place now than it's been historically. But, India and China, who were not exactly the best of friends, are both allies in this BRICS coalition. So, you have all kinds of changes. So I would say if you look at the changes that you're already seeing in the West, changes that I think can reasonably be anticipated in the region, and transformations at the global level, those create real opportunities for the Palestinians. The one element that is missing is a coherent Palestinian national movement. That was already the case prior to October 23, and I think has been exacerbated by the past 2 years. But it is of fundamental importance that the Palestinians find a way to rebuild or build, if necessary, a coherent national movement with credible leadership that is able to mobilize not only its own people, but the many millions and millions who have come out in support of Palestinian rights in the past 2 years. And put forward a strategy and a vision that is compelling to both Palestinians and their supporters, and offers also a vision that people in the region, including Israelis, will be able to accept. And so on that level, yes, we are now in the midst of a harrowing catastrophe. But I do believe that we are witnessing changes, unfortunately, as a result of this extraordinarily exorbitant price in blood that has been paid, particularly during the last 2 years. But I don't think that in several years we will be in as desultory a position as we are now. And I think there will, in fact, be very significant opportunities for the Palestinians that they can and should be able to exploit.
You are listening to This Week in Palestine, Truth and Justice Radio. I want to take a moment to spotlight 4 urgent calls to action, each rooted in solidarity, resistance, and the refusal to remain silent in the face of genocide. The first one: Rise Up for Gaza, Cambridge. Today, Sunday, August 10th at 1 p.m., join the Rise Up for Gaza rally at Cambridge Common. This is a mass mobilization to uplift Palestinian voices, demand an end to U.S. complicity, and call for a permanent ceasefire. Bring signs, bring friends, bring your rage and your love. Cambridge Common has long been a site of resistance. Let's fill it with the power of collective action. Let's make it clear, Gaza is not alone. The second one: Stand out to stop the killing Boston. Every Tuesday from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m., community members gather outside the Zionist consulate at 20 Park Plaza in Boston for the Stand Out to Stop the Killing. This is not just a protest, it's a moral stand, a public witness against the ongoing genocide in Gaza, a collective act of conscience that declares silence is complicity. We will not look away. This weekly gathering is a space where voices rise for the voiceless, where presence becomes resistance, and where humanity is reclaimed in the face of systemic violence. If you're in the Boston area, show up. Your body, your voice, your care, they matter. The third one: North Shore for Palestine's Salem Farmers Market. Thursday, August 14th from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. Join North Shore for Palestine at the Salem Farmers Market, 21 Front Street in Salem. This action demands an end to the starvation in Gaza and affirms our commitment to Palestinian liberation. If you're in the North Shore, come out and lend your support. This is a chance to connect, organize, and show that our communities will not be silent. Together, we stand for justice. Together, we make it impossible to ignore. The fourth and last one. Mobilize for divestment. Campus and community campaigns. Across the country, students and activists are launching divestment campaigns targeting institutions that fund or profit from Israeli apartheid. Whether you're on a college campus, part of a faith community, or organizing locally, now is the time to demand that your institutions cut ties with genocide. Start a petition. Host a teach-in. Pressure your school board, city council, or union. The movement for divestment is growing, and every voice adds weight. That brings us to the close of today's episode of This Week in Palestine. Stay curious, stay courageous, and keep asking the questions that challenge power and bring us closer to justice. Until next time, I'm your host, Mohammed Al-Ghul. It's been a true honor to share this space with you. If you have thoughts, questions, or want to support our work, we'd love to hear from you. Reach out anytime at TWIP-podcasts@gmail.com. A heartfelt thank you to you, our listeners, and to the brilliant team behind the scenes who make this show possible. Deep gratitude to Bob Funk, Stanley Robinson, Stephen Lowe, Sophia Rose Woolman, Dahani Abu Moza, Dr. Rana Awad, Dr. Bethany Marks, Juliet Salama Holivier, and Renad Alcool. Your commitment and spirit fuel this platform. This Week in Palestine is a production of Truth and Justice Radio, proudly broadcasting from WZBC Student Radio at Boston College. Thank you for walking this path with us as we continue the journey toward Palestinian liberation. We'll be back next week. Until then, take care and stay steadfast.